I would not live in Israel if Israel was not a Jewish and democratic state. It wouldn't be Israel if it wasn't Jewish, and it would not be Israel if it was not democratic. And therefore, as you say you said in your introduction, if the two are incompatible, we don't merely have a conceptual challenge, we have an existential crisis. And the reason why so many Israelis get so nervous about this question, and the reason why possibly we also focus on the Jewish democratic dimension, is because this is an existential crisis for us. Is this a country that we want to live in? Is this the country that we want to commit ourselves to, and our children to, and our grandchildren to? Now, most Israelis believe that Israel is and should be a Jewish and democratic state. Roughly with that statement, the thinking on the issue comes to an end. Worrying continues. Debate continues. Thinking ends. And there's a very big difference. For most Israelis, a Jewish democratic state is a state that is a little Jewish and a little democratic. And what does that mean? It means, in some Talmudic division, that we know that we're going to have to give up a little bit on Judaism in certain cases for it to be democratic, but, and here's the flip side, we also believe that it's okay to give up on a little democracy so that it'll be Jewish. Now what happens when you've already given up on certain standards, it's easy, you're already on a slippery slope. I want to be normative, start with a normative statement. For me, Israel must be Jewish and democratic, but it could only be as Jewish as democracy allows, and not as democratic as Judaism allows. Herein lies a critical decision which will divide much of the debate in our society. And one of the difficulties that we face is that when you are on a different side of the equation, it's almost you're in a completely different discourse. And your ability to argue, your ability to bridge is very, very limited. One of the great challenges that we face conceptually is, can Israel be as Jewish as democracy allows and still be sufficiently Jewish for the Zionist self-understanding of what this country means and what this country is about? That's the test. That's the question. The choice, or the way Judaism, not Jewish, Judaism enters into the state of Israel, if it is to be a democracy, it's not because it is Jewish in the sense that Jewish law ought to have authority here. It becomes Jewish because this is the culture, the values, the principles which accompany those people who constitute the Jewish nation. And as a result, this is a critical distinction which will make the possibility of democracy within Jewishness viable or not. When the authority of Jewishness in the state of Israel is grounded in some principle of what constitutes authentic Judaism, then you have created a system of authority which is antithetical to democratic institutions, such as a Knesset and a Supreme Court. You have a third institution. And many Israelis, since they're committed to a little Jewish and a little democratic, the little Jewish is, I have Jewish law. And as a result, there is an authority outside of the democratic system, which I have to be loyal to. But when Judaism only enters into this country, not because of some halachic authority, but it enters into the country because of the Jews, its authority comes from being the culture value system of this particular nation group who are coming to form a public sphere, and in their public sphere, that public sphere cannot be value neutral. It's the place in which they breathe, they speak, they give expression to who they are as a nation. What then is the difference? When Jewishness enters the state because of the Jews, and as distinct from because of God, then only those features that reflect either the consensus of those Jews as to Judaism, as to which culture and ideas and values enter into the system, are allowed. Or two, if Jewishness enters in an area where there isn't an almost complete consensus, then there could be no single expression of Jewishness within the public sphere. You don't resolve debate on Jewishness by creating value neutrality. You resolve the disagreement by creating value plurality. Judaism could enter into the public sphere through the Jews, i.e., what are the values that we care about, and what are the principles, traditions, or cultures that we want to bring into this country. So the simple examples are language. Another example is the calendar. Areas where there's a very large consensus. In our tradition, the value of having a family is so integral to the way we think about our community. It's a community made up of families. And what happens if somebody can't have a child? So those values enter into our public sphere by creating a system that, out of the limited resources of our health system, you have funded unlimited in vitro fertilization till you're 45, until you have 2 children. For Jew and non-Jew, by the way, alike. That's because that's our values. Values enter into the public sphere when there's an extensive consensus. And those are extremely natural. And they are expressive of the will, not simply of a majority, but a consensual culture of this society. If a value will enter into the public sphere, which there is not a consensus, there isn't a problem for it to do so, so long as it is not the sole expression. And thus, when Judge Cohen says, yes, the rabbinate is a blight on Israel's democracy, he's absolutely correct. Because there isn't a consensus on marriage. There's nothing wrong with having a rabbinate. But if you want to have a rabbinate funded by the state, you have to have multiple rabbinates funded by the state. If you want to have a rabbinate in charge of issues of marriage, then you have to have as well civil marriage. And these two, in order to ensure its liberal democratic standards, are only acceptable to the extent that the inalienable rights of the minority are protected as you give expression to your national identity. The power of Judaism doesn't grow from some claim of authenticity and tradition. It grows as an expression of what Jews do. Israel is Jewish in the sense that it doesn't get to define what is Judaism. Jews, the living reality of the Jews, does. But what do we do? And very briefly, and with that I'll conclude. We don't ask this question. We say it's going to be a little Jewish and a little democratic. And with that, we begin the marketplace. We begin to trade. It's a little Jewish and a little democratic. How much Jewish do you want? How much democratic do you want? And instead of having a conceptual question a conceptual conversation which states Israel could be only as Jewish as democracy allows. And how do we ensure that it has a Jewish identity and a Jewish flavor? And how do we make sure that the majority has an opportunity to express itself within the public sphere, and in so doing, represent the deepest understanding of what sovereignty means in the context of a nation state? Within the confines of democracy, we sell it, prostituting both our democratic and our religious conversation. What do you want? And what will you give me? I'll give you an example. Avigdor Lieberman has 15 seats in the Knesset. He represents a community, 33% of which aren't Jewish. A third of those who came from the former Soviet Union aren't Jewish according to the definition of orthodoxy, conservative, or reform in Israel. They came to Israel because Israel accepted the most pluralistic definition of Jewishness of any community in Jewish history. It defined Jewishness not merely in ethnic terms. It defined it in terms of a Jewish mother or a Jewish father, or married to a Jew, or converted to Judaism according to any definition, as long as it's a recognized denomination. Orthodox, conservative, reform. I don't know if Reconstructionists made it. Or if you have a Jewish grandparent. It is this is the type of law which I'm speaking about when I say Judaism enters, because this is the way the Jews, in fact, are defining themselves. Do I like it? That's not about you. Israel isn't your shul. It's not like no one appointed you the rabbi. And the law of return represents that understanding of a broad sense of what Jewishness is. But herein comes the problem. The law of return of Israel applies in only two places. It applies in Ben Gurion Airport and in the army. You're Jewish enough to get into the country and to be hugged at Ben Gurion Airport. The minute you leave, there's a cold shower. So now along comes Avigdor Lieberman and says, we need to have civil marriages in this country because, you know what, now I have a group of people who you sold my birthright, and that doesn't work for me because my constituency says I don't want to just be Jewish in Ben Gurion Airport or Jewish enough to be forced to be drafted into the army. I want to be Jewish in order to get married. Or I want to be Jewish for a whole range of other issues. Hello, I need my rights here, and you've sold them. So he stands up and says, my party platform will demand civil marriages in Israel within the first year of the coalition. And the coalition signs the agreement. But then, so Lieberman says, I care. But then Lieberman has a little problem. He encounters somebody else who also cares, in the name of Shas, Eli Yishai. He says, I know you really care, but my constituency also really cares. My constituency, in particular, this rabbinate, there's a lot of jobs. You saw how much money is distributed. My community wants Orthodox marriages in this country. And I've had it, I'm not about to give, I've had this benefit in the past, I'm not going to give it up right now. And so now we enter into a shuk. And guess what we came up with? We didn't come up with a conceptual conversation between Eli Yishai and Avigdor Lieberman. What are the inalienable rights of an individual? We came up with a law which I call the Israeli dating law. Now, just because we were embarrassed, we didn't call it that law. But that's basically what it is. This is the law, and it took 15 years for Israel, 15 years after 5% of Israeli society moves here and could not get married in the state of Israel. They can't get married because they're not Jewish. And they don't apply, they can't go to the other courts, the other ones, because they don't. The only place here you could have a citizen of the state of Israel who the only way they could get married is to go to Cyprus. Now, you all heard of the town Chelm? That's like, we're like in a different category. Like, we wish that we will reach the status of Chelm. Like, I would like to live in Chelm. Instead, I'm living in Israel. What took us 15 years? The following law. Listen carefully. You won't understand me, and that's okay, because it's ununderstandable. Those who see themselves as Jewish, and who the law of return defines as Jewish, but who outside of Ben Gurion Airport aren't defined as Jewish, are allowed to marry those people who see themselves as Jewish, whom the law of return sees them as Jewish, but who outside of Ben Gurion Airport aren't seen as Jewish. Now, those who see themselves as Jewish and are defined as Jewish by the law of return, but who we don't see as Jewish, aren't allowed to marry someone who we don't see as Jewish. The only ones they're allowed to marry are those people who see themselves as Jewish and whom the law of return sees themselves as Jewish. So now, basically, what the country said, 350,000 Russians, I'm going to tell you who you can date. That's why it's the dating law. You can't fall in love. You can't fall in love. That's the compromise. I, Avigdor Lieberman, need a little civil marriage. I, Eli Yishai, need a little rabbinic marriages. What do we come up with? Stupidity. Stupidity. When you're not in Israel, you get a right to go to your synagogue and to state, what do I think is authentic Jewish law? And build a synagogue around what you think is authentic. And anybody who doesn't agree with you, you can say to them, wonderful, build your own shul. I don't want you by me. I'm happy when you don't come to me. And an ultra-Orthodox synagogue could sit right next to a Reform synagogue in Manhattan, and nobody for the life of them would think that they have anything to say or any authority over the other. The essence of Zionism is the decision of the Jewish people to build a homeland of the Jewish people. A homeland of the Jewish people is not just where Jews live. It's where we have an opportunity to bring our culture, our values, our principles into the public sphere. How we do so, however, will make all the difference. We can do so within and in accordance with democratic principles, so long as we recognize that Judaism has authority here only because of the Jews, and as long as we recognize that Israel can be as Jewish as democracy allows, and not as democratic as Judaism allows. Thank you.